we've just seen Mitt Romney's speech there. What's your take? How'd he do?
Well, I thought it was a fairly flat speech. I mean, he's got an adoring audience. His moment in the sun. He's obviously a guy who speaks with confidence, but it wasn't, I think, a rousing speech. He was attempting to address, I think, 4 obvious gaps. The first of these gaps was a kind of biography gap. Who am I? Lots of people, even though he's been around for a long time, about 6 years running for president, don't really quite know who this guy is. That they see someone who looks made for president, made for the movies of president, but they're not sure about his background, where his religion comes into things, how he maybe got so fabulously wealthy. And I don't think he did a lot to flesh out that background. He talked fairly well about his mother, and that addressed the second gap the Republicans have in general, which is a gender gap. Women are supporting the Democratic Party at about almost 10% higher than they're supporting the Republican Party, which is pretty unusual. In most countries, women and men vote in fairly similar ways, where in America it seems increasingly that women are more drawn to the Democratic Party and men to the Republican Party, which is kind of an unusual thing to happen. And I think Romney and all of the speakers have tried to talk about their moms, have tried to talk about how hard women work, how equal women are, but maybe there again I think this will be a difficult sort of story to tell. The other sort of 2 gaps he wanted to fill was an empathy gap, to show he cared, to show that he really understands how people struggle in America, even though the struggles in his family are maybe 1 or 2 or 3 generations ago. So all of the speakers have talked about kind of rags to riches stories. There's been a really common theme of saying, our families were once nothing as immigrants, like Marco Rubio said. We worked really hard under a free enterprise system, not much government help. We got great. Mitt Romney can't really tell that story because his father was a governor. He's incredibly wealthy himself, and he struggled, I think, to work out how to get around that apart from have other people do the job for him. He talked briefly about Bain. I think we'll hear a lot about that in the weeks to come. He said Bain had helped companies like Staples become great American companies, but Bain also lost a lot of people's jobs and saddled a lot of companies with debt. Apparently debt is one of the great evils of the modern world, as this convention has the debt sort of chart for the United States there on the wall. But Bain's story also is a lot about getting companies into very serious debt and sometimes closing them down. So I think there's a complicated and difficult story for Romney to square there. The last gap was this kind of likability gap, to say, okay, is this guy really likable? Can Americans have him in their lounge rooms for 4 years or possibly 8 years with this reasonably long chance on public television, on all the televisions in America, many of them would have been playing this? Did he really come across as someone who was at least palatable, likable to some extent? I'd say he probably just sort of squeaked under the test of would you invite this guy in your door if he became knocking. Not to suggest anything about the group he might have formerly been knocking for in France, but he still struggles on this front. My overall take is that Romney has run a fairly weak campaign, but with a slightly better performance in the debates, which I don't think is totally sort of unlikely or impossible, this will become a closer race, because it's been to this point, I think, a pretty weak campaign by Romney. If it gets better, which it could do, this will become a closer race. And this is a marginal step to getting better, but I don't think it was a big step.
Luke, this evening was the first time for a lot of Americans that they really paid attention to Romney. How do you think Romney came across to them?
There was a point where I remember he said, I don't remember exactly how he phrased it, but don't you wish you were here right now? I thought that was very telling. He wasn't speaking to the convention there. He wasn't speaking to the Republican base like Ryan did yesterday. This was a speech to the American people, to the moderates, to the people who aren't sure who they're going to vote for. And I think it was the right message to take. There was this idea when Ryan joined the ticket that this was going to be this huge debate about policy suddenly, and that 2 clear different visions of America. This wasn't what that was about. It was to people who liked Obama but couldn't maybe realize that they haven't gotten better off, and he was reassuring them that if you don't want to vote for him, we're not that scary. This is an acceptable other choice. I thought he was at his best when he talked about personal examples. His mother, the Rose thing resonated. A few other cases about having your children close to home. I thought it was weaker when he started getting more into generalities. Some of the comments about America more broadly, I don't think resonated. So I would say it was the right kind of speech. It was good, but it wasn't exceptional. He's not the kind of person who can really, he doesn't come across as genuine and likable to the degree someone like Obama was. But I think this is the kind of message he had to try and give here.
Tom, did it work for you?
Well, Jonathan, I'd probably take a more sympathetic view to the Romney speech. I thought that, it reminded me of a remark that Richard Nixon, the Republican president in the late 60s, early 70s, once told Bob Dole, his friend and understudy who ran for president in '96. He said, in the Republican primaries, you run as fast as you can to the right, and you move as fast as you can to the centre. And I think that's what we saw today. There wasn't the ideological red meat that many of us saw throughout the second half of last year and the first few weeks and months of this year. This was really a pitch to middle America, which is well to the centre of where the Tea Party is, for instance. I thought that he exposed Obama's flaws more in sorrow than in anger. I think that was a very important pitch. Too many people on the Tea Party right, if you like, to put it politely, are incapable of understatement, and they do shoot from the hip. I think Romney struck the right tone in that regard. And I thought there were some really good one-liners there, such as this one. You know there's something wrong with the kind of job the president's done when the best feeling you had was the day you voted for him. I thought that really resonated with not just the audience, but people in their living rooms. And then this line too, about President Obama promised to slow the rise of the oceans and to heal the planet. My promise is to help you and your family. So more practical, play down expectations and the hope, if you like, about grandiose visions. And I think he feels the pain, genuinely, of a lot of folks who are clearly worse off today than they were 4 years ago. A couple of other quick points. I thought that there was obviously, like in a lot of these convention speeches, very little policy substance, particularly on foreign policy. I think there were only about 3 lines on foreign policy. Now, that is extraordinary when you consider that America, like Australia, has been bogged down in a war that has lasted longer than both World War I and World War II. Afghanistan was not even mentioned, which I thought was interesting, not even a line. And the other point to bear in mind is that his whole foreign policy agenda is about America having a new American century, this global hegemon that can impose America's will and leadership across the globe. Yet there was very little substance when it talked about, when he addressed the issue of America's role in the world. I thought that was a glaring contrast. The other point that I make is a very cultural one, which is, and it was really quite evident in Marco Rubio's introduction, the notion of American exceptionalism. I mean, the motto of this convention is, "We believe in America." And you'll hear this next week as well, but not to the same extent. I think exceptionalism has now become a partisan rallying point for a lot of Republicans. Frank Rich wrote an article in the New York Magazine that would refer to all the references to American exceptionalism in all the major newspapers in the United States, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, the New York Times, from 1980 to 2000. There were 400 references. From 2000 to 2010, there were 2,000 references. From 2010 to 2012, there were 4,500 references. So this constant reference to American exceptionalism, this belief that America is special and has a destiny to promote democracy around the world and be the greatest power in the world, that language has seemed to me has been beefed up, and it reflects in many respects, I think, this cultural crisis that is being felt all across America. But all things considered, I thought, like Ryan yesterday, he did a decent job of tapping into a widespread sense of political estrangement and economic anxiety, which is being felt in many parts of America today.
Thank you, Tom. You mentioned, this is for all 3 of you, Tom mentioned Romney's comments on foreign policy. What did you guys think Australians should take from this speech? What was from tonight? What did Australians learn about what a President Romney would mean for the world?
I mean, I think both of the speakers are right. I mean, the main theme of the speech is disappointment. I mean, that is a useful way to make the argument. You can understand why they're trying to make the argument this way. Tom's point about exceptionalism, I think, is a fascinating one from the outside. I've got a bright student just about to do an honours thesis on this, and I think it's a terrific topic. And the reason for this is that it strikes me as not just a cultural problem within the United States, it strikes me as an anxiety. That you mention how great you are when you may be feeling that your nation isn't quite as strong in the world as it once was. It represents, I think, a certain anxiety, and you heard the boos every time China was mentioned about another rising power in the world. And I think from an Australian point of view, of course, this is fascinating. To think of America in some ways as this country that we've, I suppose, had a sense would be such a dominant power, to now feel anxious about its place, and I think playing out in its politics in this regard of talking itself up, particularly on the Republican side, but Obama, I think, buys into this to some extent in a defensive way, in some ways, because when he talked about America being about as exceptional as Britain or as Greece, people jumped on him and said, no, the presidents don't talk like that. America is more exceptional than anywhere else. So for Australia, this has, of course, presented tricky problems because we've become a country that America is now taking giving more attention to in some ways because of a focus on the Asia-Pacific region. So this election maybe matters more to Australia because Australia is less of a backwater than it's been for a good deal of its political history, and this is why comments like Romney's about trade wars with China should probably make Australia feel more anxious than in many other elections. In some ways, we can be sort of observers from afar without enormous amounts of obvious immediate consequences for these elections on us.
Yeah, I'd simply add that's right, and also that Romney, and I suspect we'll hear this next week from President Obama, very little emphasis on foreign policy, and I would argue that Americans today are less interested in foreign policy than they've ever been since the heyday of isolationism in the 1920s and 1930s. And why is this the case? Well, I think increasingly Americans are obviously focused on domestic issues because of the poor state of the economy, persistently high levels of unemployment, the debt mountains of European proportions, and of course the overwhelming sense that America is in decline and the country is going down the wrong track. The other thing to bear in mind is that in a nation that's acutely sensitive to public opinion, these daily opinion polls we see in the United States. I mean, we talk about the fortnightly news poll in Australia. In America, it's daily, and it's more than one group that puts out these polls. It's this focus group surveys, the relentless 24/7 media and internet environment. I think all of this means that politicians are severely downgrading foreign policy in their calculations, and you saw that today. I think you'd be lucky to put together maybe 3 or 4 sentences on foreign policy, which I found quite extraordinary. John McCain spent more on foreign policy in 2008, as indeed did Barack Obama, and of course George W. Bush and Bill Clinton also spoke a lot more about foreign policy. So I think that's a very interesting development.
I agree, but one thing he did mention on foreign policy is that he'd like America to have a military that's so strong no nation would dare to test it. Is that sort of talk still going to resonate with the American people, do you think?
Well, it's certainly as American as apple pie. I mean, we have to remember that the idea of American global hegemony has been very much part and parcel of the national psychology since the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War. But of course, it's one thing to champion an interventionist, activist, assertive role in the world, but that is fundamentally incompatible with the idea of downsizing government and slashing spending, which is also on his ticket. I think there is an incoherence difference there between ends and means, and it's not altogether clear that the American people are prepared to pay for these kind of sacrifices. I mean, again, the fact that Afghanistan was hardly mentioned. The United States spends $100 billion a year in Afghanistan. It's cost more than 2,000 US lives, and not to mention lives in Afghanistan, plus the other coalition troops, and Australia lost 5 yesterday. No mention of that at all. I found that quite extraordinary. I'll be curious to know if the President mentions Afghanistan next week. I mean, this has been a real derelict of duty. Both candidates, and you could say the same thing in Australia, I would argue, about Julia Gillard and even Tony Abbott. The only time they mention Afghanistan is when there is a fatality, death. It's quite remarkable that after 11 years, with really no satisfactory end in sight, that none of the candidates talk about it at all.
Changing tack there. Luke, Tom mentioned Mitt Romney's line about how you know there's something wrong with the job the president's done when the best feeling you've had is the day you voted for him. Has Mitt Romney persuaded Americans tonight that Obama is a lost cause?
Well, I don't think he's done that, but I did think that was a good line. I think that sort of style of attack of saying we don't dislike Obama, but he's failed us is what it's going to take. And it's less about convincing than reassuring Americans that it's okay to change course. We're going to have to wait and see how it does in the polls. Traditionally, candidates or parties get about a 5% bounce coming out of conventions. That's the average, but it varies really dramatically. Sometimes it's way more than that. Sometimes it's almost none at all. It could be less this time around just because we're in such a polarized environment that people are more set in their ways. But this is important to see how the polls look after this, and especially after the DNC next week, and whether the polls reset or whether these changes stay for a while. There's some belief amongst people that conventions don't really matter, that the debates are what's important. People want real red meat policy discussion, but I think the statistics show that conventions actually move public opinion more than the debates. And so a lot of people's opinions have solidified by after the debates are over. I think it's about 95% of Americans have made up their decision by the end of the debate. So I think, I can't tell you for sure how the speech resonated today, but in the next couple of weeks, I think we're going to have a really good sense of where this race is at.
Do you guys think that this has been a changing moment for the campaign? Romney's been consistently a couple points behind Obama in poll averages all summer. Has this switched up the game?
No. This isn't a moment of, as I said before, of great charisma. I mean, the excitement in the hall is probably the most excited people in America about it. I think there's big arguments to be played out in the debates. I mean, Romney put 5 ideas forward in terms of a plan. He talked about making America energy independent. That means more drilling off the coasts of America, probably off in Alaska as well, which will be controversial, and Obama will, I think, argue against. He argued for more school choice, which means vouchers, which is something the Democrats in general are pretty opposed to, so that's an interesting policy debate. We talked about trade partnerships and trade wars. Many presidents have. Bill Clinton talked about taking the fight to China on trade, and then traded an enormous amount with China. So that, I think, could be a bit empty in some regards. Talked about balancing the budget. The details there, I think, are going to be a big part of the campaign from this point onwards. If debt is the big issue the Republicans want to focus on, I think we've got to there'll be a debate about tax increases, and I think both the response to Ryan's speech and probably the response to Romney's speech will be your figures don't add up, and you're exaggerating how much Obama may want to tax the middle class or tax small business. And the last one was this argument about health coverage and small business, which will be, I think, a huge kind of policy debate, and that not everyone will follow in great detail, but I think is one of the most central issues of the campaign, is America has a massive problem with health expenditure. I mean, it's spending so much on health compared to other nations, and it's not just a government problem. It's I think, predominantly a problem of insurance companies taking a lot of money out of this part of the economy, and also doctors. Doctors probably over-servicing their patients, giving them far too many drugs where they don't need them. So having a real debate on these issues is hopeful from my point of view, but I think that's the kind of stuff that could change the debates and could change the campaign. And this was, I think, just too light to be really of any seminal importance as speech.
Tom, what did you think of that 5-point plan for restarting the economy? It wasn't all criticism of Obama.
No, what intrigued me about the speech on the policy front today was that he distinguished himself from Paul Ryan, his running mate. In Ryan's speech yesterday, he unashamedly championed the idea of economic reform and entitlement reform, and made the argument that because a lot of these entitlements in the United States, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, are on an unsustainable trajectory, they need to be reformed, otherwise the government will go bankrupt and these programs won't be around for the next generation of Americans. Romney didn't really talk that language today. And I think it's largely because he's not a true believer in an economic reform agenda. I was struck, getting back to the other question you asked, Jonathan, that the conventional wisdom a few weeks ago when Mitt Romney selected Paul Ryan as his running mate, the conventional wisdom was that this was a very bold, radical, risky adventure. I think we both, in our own way, subscribe to that in various publications. But if you look at the polls in the last 3 weeks, if anything, Romney and Ryan have managed to close the gap in some of those battleground states, most notably Wisconsin, Virginia, Ohio, and Florida. Now, this is quite extraordinary because the conventional wisdom was that this was such a bold and daring and risky strategy that the Democrats would be able to nationalise the campaign and launch a Medicare campaign against the Republicans and scare a lot of the elderly voters in those battleground states, most notably in Florida. Well, that hasn't happened yet, at least. And I think that Romney's speech today, which was light on the policy substance, would not have scared a lot of those people. So, to the extent that it was a successful speech, I think it may well have resonated with a lot of those groups. It certainly softens the hard edges of what is otherwise a very bold, radical economic reform agenda.
So, Tom and I think you, Luke, both said that this was a speech for the centre. It wasn't aimed at the base. But we've heard throughout this campaign that the base isn't sure about Romney. Do you think they're feeling good about him now?
I think the whole notion that the base didn't trust Romney was overrated. You actually look at the polls from earlier in the year, his support amongst even Tea Partiers, and some people identified themselves as very conservative, was higher than you would think. And it was very comparable to Santorum and Gingrich. And at this point, I think anyone who didn't trust Romney as being conservative enough is never going to be voting for Obama and would dislike Obama enough that they're going to go out and vote for this ticket. So I don't see it as I don't think he ever really had to persuade people that he was more conservative here. It does help you, I guess, a little bit with fundraising and with getting people to work and help turn out other voters, but I don't really think it was a big issue, and I think Romney is running the most conservative campaign in decades. It's fine. He has the conservative support that he needs.
I can hear the voice of my colleague David Smith, who's on the other side of the Pacific, and David, if you know him, has a voice that doesn't always require a microphone. And David's one of David's favourite lines about Romney is to say he won with the lowest percent of the evangelical Christian vote, the white evangelical Christian vote, in the primaries of any recent candidate. And I think that is probably this question of enthusiasm. Will these people get out to vote in large numbers? In 2000, there was a bit of a suppression of the evangelical Christian vote because it came out late that George W. Bush had, on one occasion, been caught drinking and driving. He was out with Newcombe, the Australian tennis player, John Newcombe, that night. You know, you drink with John Newcombe, you get yourself in trouble. He's a bit of a black belt of drinking, and this turned off some of the evangelicals. They didn't get out to vote. Now that changed in 2004. There was a much better effort, and it probably made a bit of a difference in Ohio. I think that Romney will be thinking of these issues. I think this convention in general wasn't one that harped or made a big thing of social conservative issues or those things. Romney, I think, pointedly said in the speech that he was pro-life, so he put his anti-abortion credentials now on the table. He said he was against, I think he said he was against different forms of marriages, meaning he was against gay marriage. So he put those things out there pretty quickly and just moved on. But I think there probably is a group of voters maybe in places like Ohio who don't vote every time, who Romney is still a candidate that they're probably not that enthusiastic about.
Tom, should I give you the last word and then we'll open up for questions?
Well, I think it's certainly true that the Republican base were very uneasy about Mitt Romney. I know that Luke's got those figures, which is plausible, but nevertheless, the Tea Party base of the Republican Party throughout the course of last year and the early part of this year felt that Romney was either a chronic flip-flopper or a closet liberal, which is heresy in Republican ranks. But they were dragged kicking and screaming, and I think in large part because Romney had such an impressive organisation and a lot of money to throw around. Let's not forget that there were about 6 anybody but Romney candidates during the course of last year and early this year. And I even made a fool of myself for thinking that Newt Gingrich of all people might have a chance of doing this. So I've still got egg on my face. So I think the Republican base is very uneasy about him, but nevertheless they're aggravated because they're not happy with Obama's direction. And I think they are energised by the Paul Ryan selection. He comforts them, particularly on the economic issues.
To be fair to you, Tom, I think you made your pick before and you said you wanted to make the moon the 51st state. Questions for the panel? Yes, sir, in the grey jacket there.
So, as you know, Paul Ryan's speech from yesterday had its fair share of inaccuracies and whatnot. Were there any gaping holes, inaccuracies, or hypotheses within Mitt Romney's speech that you could tell us about?
Well, it was vague enough on policy details that it was tough to really fact check many things, and I think that was sort of purposeful. He didn't want to articulate a tight vision. He wanted to sort of give these sort of more broad comments. But there was one area where I think it was pretty clear that it was off base. He started off by saying we all wanted Obama to succeed, Republicans wanted to work with him. Whatever you think of how the Republicans acted in Congress, that isn't true. Mitch McConnell, the House Senate Minority Leader, said from day one, our first priority is to deny Obama a second term. And they continuously used the filibuster and other legislative means to block Obama's legislation from going through. They turned against proposals they had previously supported, health care, immigration reform, and such. And so I think if I was Obama next week, I would really start off by highlighting this, because the Republicans are trying to create this image of we really wanted to work together, and Obama didn't. And it's pretty clear the Republicans did not want to work with Obama from day one. So I think if you're Obama, you have a chance next week to take that message and turn it on its head. Say, yes, we do want to come together as a country. It's them who didn't want to do it.
Yeah, thanks. I'll just make a comment as a politician. The convention is like a switch that goes from everyone competing against each other to the campaign against Obama being unveiled, and that's what I find really exciting about it. How do you take on the first black American president, and what will your messaging be? And that is kind of unveiled at the convention today, which I thought was really interesting. And secondly, having been to America, the focus on the argument about defining what the issues will be in the campaign, it can all, in many ways, be more important than what you're saying about the issues. So, for example, they want the issue clearly to be jobs, and we saw that unveiled in the convention today. And the messaging is, it's not about the rest of the world, I'm here for you, which is why, Tom, I don't think talking about foreign policy would have been consistent with the messaging. I've been astounded in America that some campaigns spend more than 50% of their astounding budgets on research, and that research is about, everything in that speech is researched. And so the messaging is telling us what Americans care about, or what they want Americans to care about in the campaign.
Well, the focus group surveys.
Yeah.
Correct. And so the battle becomes not only between the candidates, but between the candidates and the media to define what this campaign is about. And the convention is the moment that they unveil that strategy. And I thought that came through loud and clear in that speech. And if they can make it about jobs and about you, and if they can. I just thought the whole approach to Obama was fascinating and very subtle, and I believe that we will have quite an interesting fight arising from what I heard today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Would anyone like to respond to that?
Oh, well, no, I agree with what you said. No, I think that's right. The focus group survey, and look, the same thing's happening in Australia too. I mean, increasingly, yes. So the Americans, admittedly, have been the trendsetters. I think it probably goes back to the Clinton era when you had the focus group survey really coming of age, and it's proliferated in the last 10 to 15 years.
Yes, sir.
A comment. It must have been a difficult decision for the vice presidential choice when we saw the performance of Mario Rubio.
Oh, yeah, Rubio, yeah.
And I thought his and Clint Eastwood's contribution was, very impressive. I don't know if Obama will be game to draw on somebody from Hollywood after Clint Eastwood rubbished the loonies, as he's called them, in the liberal left in Hollywood. So if they were planning to have the personality thing, it might be difficult against Clint Eastwood's first salvo. The second question, how many debates will there be and when would they be?
There's going to be 3 debates, so should we look ahead to the debates? Any comment on...
We might get in another question.
Okay, yes, sir.
The 3 presidential debates, 1 vice president debate, so Ryan and Biden will face off as well.
And when?
I think we'll have them up on our website. These are things we're all fairly interested in here, so we'll have the schedule up on our website for US studies.
Will you be doing it here? Will you be doing it here?
I'll talk about that next. Maybe if we keep going with questions. If anyone's got questions at this point.
Molly Ball from the Atlantic was waxing lyrical yesterday about the performance of Condi Rice a couple of days ago. Where do you see her future in the Republican Party now? Is she a viable presidential prospect in 2016?
I mean, people get very excited about Rice. The kind of Rice-Hillary Clinton runoff was some people's kind of fantasy, in 2008. And I suppose people quite rightly think, well, when will America have its first female president? She obviously is someone who was very close to the Bush family, and particularly George W. Bush. So having her out there is in some ways a kind of healing force with that bit of America's past. It was interesting, I thought, when Romney was criticising, and Rubio to some extent, the conditions in America today, you could have thought, well, that speech could have been made in 2008 as well about the Bush administration. I mean, some of the criticisms that America had, serious financial problems then, debt problems, that growth was, pretty anemic. So there was this sense that I think Rice has used to kind of heal something with the Bush era and say, look, not everything that came out of the Bush era, like Cheney, we need to hide. There are some people that we can be proud of, and this person is, quite obviously a talent, a very sharp individual. I saw bits of her speech. I mean, I don't think she's quite ready for the campaign trail myself, but maybe a vice presidential choice is not inconceivable, although she's more of a media darling, really, than I'd say a darling of the party.
Yes, sir.
Out of which candidates, Romney or Obama, whoever's elected, will more likely discipline Iran militarily with their nuclear pursuits, do you think?
Shall we hand this one to you, Tom?
Well, Romney's rhetoric is clearly more hawkish than Obama's. But I don't think either president is keen for a showdown with Iran, quite frankly, and I don't think the American people are panting for another preemptive strike in the Persian Gulf. They're still badly battered and bruised after what many regard now as misbegotten ventures in Iraq and Afghanistan. So there's no real appetite. Having said that though, and all bets are off in the next 2 months, if the Prime Minister Netanyahu decides to launch a preemptive strike against Iran's nuclear facilities, you can bet your bottom dollar that both candidates, and indeed the broad cross-section of the American people, would rally around Netanyahu and Israel.
In public, I think behind closed doors, Obama will be kind of furious. I mean, Netanyahu and the Democratic Party, I think there is clear tension there. Romney made this statement that Obama had thrown Israel under a bus. I think that's kind of ludicrous to some extent. I mean, America is still a very strong supporter of Israel, but the connection between the Republican Party and Netanyahu's government is much stronger and much more deeply felt than with the Democrats, where I think there's probably genuine dislike on both sides, and that goes back to the Clinton administration. Hillary Clinton herself, I think, has probably serious problems with Benjamin Netanyahu, and I'd say Obama would as well, because Netanyahu is someone who I think the Americans see that they can't control or don't have a serious dialogue with in a way that they think would be very helpful.
One more question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, a couple of comments and a question. First of all, on the Marco Rubio thing, I think we're going to see a lot more of him in 4 years or 8 years' time. That's bound to happen. Secondly, on the foreign policy thing, didn't surprise me at all. Americans, after all the years of Iraq and Afghanistan, are over it, and they don't have answers. Secondly, they're terribly embarrassed on the world stage. They don't know how to deal with it, and it doesn't surprise me at all that it's slipping from front and centre stage. But my question is this: religion was not touched today, and there was hardly a reference to Mormonism. I'm wondering what the panel thinks about the way it was handled or ignored today, and what impact it is going to have through the campaign. I'm talking about Romney.
Great question. Why don't we throw another one in? You had a question as well, and we'll answer them two at a time.
Yeah, my question was that, sure, I agree that there wasn't much said about foreign policy or Afghanistan, but there was one sort of critical reference there, I thought, to Afghanistan, and he compared it to when the Russians were there and how they failed. And then I'm not sure whether he was having two bob each way or whether he was really trying to test the water, where he said, Obama's, why are they there, why are they there? And he said, if I had my way, Morris, I would bring him home tomorrow. Now, I don't know whether that was a promise that he would bring him home tomorrow, or when he gets in, or whether he was just testing the waters. I thought that was interesting.
Quickly on your comments, I agree with you about Rubio 100%. I thought he would have made a very good vice presidential choice. He has a lot of the same pluses that Ryan has. He's liked by the Tea Party base and the Republican establishment, but he also has a lot of advantages. He hasn't touched the third rail of politics as much as Ryan has. He's Hispanic, and his Hispanic vote is going to be so important. He's from a key swing state. And I thought when you heard him talk today, he's very natural and sounds, it resonates. And as an American myself, like hearing him talk about America, you like it in a way that, I don't know, Romney's story doesn't feel quite as genuine. The Mormonism thing, it's true he didn't mention that much, but it's also been entirely absent from the campaign trail. And actually today, you didn't get to see it here, but some of the earlier speakers were members of Romney's congregation talking about some of the good things that he had, and charitable works that he had done. And even working it into his speech here was something of an accomplishment. And I think it's a very good move for him to make, especially as we get to the general election. There's this talk about Romney you need to humanize Romney, make him more empathetic. Religion is a huge part of his life. Santorum was talking so much about on the campaign trail. Romney is just as religious as he is. And so I think if you just try and paper over it, no wonder Romney comes off as seeming like robotic. This is a huge part of his life that you're just leaving out.
I mean, two good questions. The one on religion, he tried to pass over it pretty quickly by saying that kids in his own hometown of Detroit were more interested in what sporting team he followed rather than his religion. I think Luke's dead right that it is a huge part of his life. He was basically a pastor within that church. Mormonism doesn't encourage people to talk about their past, their role in the church. He also knows that Mormonism makes quite a lot of Americans nervous, as some don't see it as a Christian faith. So he has, he's in difficult waters there because Americans expect their politicians to talk about their past and their biography a lot. That is very typical. We've got a president at the moment who wrote 2 memoirs before he really even hit the serious campaign trail. So that absence, I think, is quite remarkable and quite unusual. The question about Afghanistan, I think, was a very good one. There was, I think, these oblique mentions of, the Russians, wasted obviously a lot of their own soldiers and money there for 10 years in a failed campaign. America, suggesting that America was going to have, learn from that probably isn't to have the greatest grasp of how American foreign policy always gets carried out. But I think the point he was making about a date was arguing that Obama was doing something incorrect by naming a date when American troops would come home. And you don't name a date. If you're going to name a date, you might as well come home immediately. I think this is a bit of a sort of fatuous argument because Romney doesn't have an alternative position apart from maybe stay there for a very, very, very long time or abandon the cause. And I think his instincts would be to stay there for maybe a bit longer than Obama's. So I think he's really just trying to win on that issue without putting his own view across, as Tom was arguing.
We'll wrap it up. But, in response to both your points, on Rubio, just quickly, yes, he brings a lot of star power. Swing state, Florida, Cuban American, and of course he has impeccable Tea Party credentials. But bear in mind, he was vetted extensively for this role as Vice President, and he clearly did not pass the test. Now, I joke with friends that anyone who's married to a Miami Dolphins cheerleader must have skeletons in his closet. So who knows? Who knows? Just bear that in mind. On the Mormonism, on the foreign policy issue, this point doesn't get made enough, but you talked about international credibility and America's image in the world. A little known fact, America's favourability record rating in many key Muslim countries, Egypt, Pakistan and Turkey, has declined. It's actually lower today than it was in 2007 and 2008, President Bush's last 2 years of his second term. So that's an interesting figure. And on the Mormonism issue, well, look, he himself, Romney himself, jokes a bit about it. When he was asked during the Republican primaries in a debate in 2008 against Fred Thompson, Rudy Giuliani, John McCain, all these guys, of course, have been divorced, married twice, maybe 3 times. He responded, Romney responded to accusations that he somehow supported polygamy by reminding everyone that he was the only candidate who only had 1 wife. So look, it's not going to be an issue for him in this campaign.
He certainly gave God a good mention.
That's as American as apple pie. Obama will do the same thing next week.
Well, thank you all very much.